There is a particular kind of salvation that has nothing to do with religion, though it can feel indistinguishable from it. It arrives not through doctrine or ritual but through encounter, the specific, unrepeatable moment when a person who has been struggling to understand what they are and whether the world has any use for what they are suddenly encounters evidence that the answer is yes, that the thing they carry, the thing that has made them strange to everyone around them, that has produced confusion and rejection and the grinding daily labor of existing as someone the world does not quite have a category for. That thing is not a defect, it is a gift. And somewhere in the world, someone else has carried it before them and made it into something magnificent. Prince Rogers Nelson was 7 years old when he first heard Little Richard. He was growing up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a city not immediately associated with the kind of music that would eventually make him one of the most extraordinary artists of the 20th century, in a household shaped by the specific tensions of a family where music was central and domestic stability was not. His father, John L. Nelson, was a jazz pianist and bandleader who performed under the name Prince Rogers, the name he would give his son, a gift that carried both love and a kind of inheritance. His mother, Mattie Shaw, sang with his father's band. Music was the air in the house, the primary language through which meaning was made and transmitted. But the young prince was already something that the air in the house could not entirely explain. He was small for his age, sensitive in ways that drew both admiration and cruelty, possessed of an interior life so rich and so particular that ordinary social interaction felt like a foreign country he was always slightly failing to navigate correctly. He was different. He knew he was different. And in Minneapolis in the early 1960s, being different in the specific ways that Prince was different, the sensitivity, the theatricality, the refusal to modulate his expressiveness to fit what the world around him considered appropriate, was not a comfortable thing to be. And then he heard Little Richard. The specific recording, the specific moment has been described in various ways across the years, but the essential experience was consistent in every telling. He heard a voice doing something that voices were not supposed to do. He heard a piano being played with a physicality and an abandon that the instrument was not supposed to be capable of. He heard a performer who was not managing his expressiveness or apologizing for his theatricality or trimming his flamboyance to fit a more acceptable container. He heard someone being entirely, completely unapologetically themselves, and the world, rather than punishing that completeness, was responding to it with something that sounded like worship. For a child who had spent years understanding, in the wordless way that children understand fundamental things, that who he was might not be entirely welcome in the world, that specific sound was not just music, it was permission. It was the first evidence he had encountered, outside his own interior conviction, that the thing inside him was not something to be corrected, it was something to be amplified. He never forgot this. He said so in various forms, throughout his life. To understand what Little Richard gave Prince, you have to understand what Little Richard had built, and what it had cost him to build it. Because the permission that Prince received when he heard that voice was not a casual gift, it was the product of a life lived in full collision with a world that had consistently tried to make Little Richard smaller, quieter, more manageable, more acceptable, more contained. Richard Wayne Penniman had come from Macon, Georgia, from the Pentecostal churches where the Spirit moved through bodies visibly and loudly, from the roadhouses and medicine shows in Chitlin, circuit venues where he had learned to hold a room through sheer force of presence, from the years of rejection by record labels that could not categorize what he was offering and therefore declined to offer it to the world. He had built, through all of that resistance, a performing identity that was unlike anything that had existed before. Flamboyant, physically total, spiritually rooted, impossible to ignore or to adequately describe, the pompadour. The makeup, the glittering costumes that made him visible from the back of any room, the piano stool kicked across the stage, the voice that moved between registers the way lightning moves between clouds, fast, total, following its own logic rather than any established convention, the scream that opened Tutti Frutti and told the world in the most unambiguous possible terms that something was happening here that had not happened before. All of this had been built against resistance, not just the industry's resistance, though that had been real and consequential and financially damaging in ways that never fully healed, but a deeper, more personal resistance. The resistance of a world that did not know what to do with someone who moved the way Little Richard moved, who dressed the way he dressed, who performed with the specific quality of total self-expression that characterized every moment he spent on a stage. He had insisted on being fully himself anyway, not without cost, not without the ongoing spiritual conflict that characterized his entire relationship with his own identity and his own gifts, not without the departures and returns, the gospel school and the secular stage, the decades of wrestling with the question of whether who he was and what he did were compatible with who he was supposed to be. But he had insisted. And the insistence, the refusal to shrink, to apologize, to perform a version of himself that was more acceptable to the world's existing categories, was the specific thing that had reached the young prince in Minneapolis and told him something he desperately needed to know. The world had not destroyed Little Richard for being who he was. The world had, eventually and imperfectly and with significant financial injustice along the way, responded to what he offered. The response was not always fair or adequate or proportionate to the value of what he had created. But it was real. People loved him. People were transformed by his performances. People carried his music inside them for decades after first hearing it. If Little Richard could be Little Richard and survive, more than survive, could create something that the world could not ignore, then perhaps Prince could be Prince. That was the gift. That was what Prince meant when he said, in various forms across the years, that Little Richard had saved his life. He did not mean it metaphorically exactly. He meant it with the specific literalness of someone who understands that the permission to be fully yourself, when it arrives at the right moment in the right form, is the difference between a life that is lived and a life that is managed. Prince became a musician with the specific devotion of someone who has found the one language in which they are entirely fluent. He taught himself instruments, guitar, piano, drums, bass, with a speed and a completeness that people around him found difficult to explain by reference to anything except some fundamental correspondence between Prince and music, as though the instruments were extensions of a nervous system that had always been configured for exactly this. By his early teens he was performing. By his mid-teens he was writing songs that the adults around him recognized as something beyond what teenagers typically produced. By 17 he was in serious conversations with major record labels about a deal. The parallels with Little Richard's early trajectory were not coincidental. Prince had absorbed the older man's music so completely that the absorption had become structural, part of the foundation on which everything he built was constructed. The specific elements of Little Richard's performing identity that had given the young Prince permission to exist were now being transformed in Prince's hands into something new. Not imitation, not reproduction, something that carried the same essential qualities, the theatricality, the physical totality, the refusal to modulate expressiveness for anyone else's comfort, through an entirely different musical and cultural context. The flamboyance that Little Richard had pioneered in the 1950s, Prince recontextualized for the 1970s and 1980s, the gender-bending performance aesthetic that had made Little Richard genuinely transgressive in his era, the makeup, the costumes, the refusal to perform conventional masculinity, became in Prince's hands something that went further and pushed harder against different but related cultural boundaries. The gospel-rooted ecstasy that had powered Little Richard's performances became, filtered through Prince's particular combination of influences, a new kind of sacred sexuality, music that understood the body as a site of both spiritual and physical transcendence simultaneously. Prince acknowledged this lineage explicitly. He was not someone who hid his influences or minimized his debts in the way that some artists do, who prefer the myth of pure originality to the more complicated truth of how creative work actually develops through encounter and absorption and transformation. He named Little Richard. He spoke about what the older man's music had meant to him. He performed Little Richard songs in concert, not as tribute in the diminished sense of that word, but as genuine acts of homecoming, a musician returning to the source material that had made his own work possible. And he sought him out. This is perhaps the most significant part of the story. Prince, at the peak of his own extraordinary fame, made a point of finding Little Richard, of being in the same room with him, of speaking with him directly, of communicating in person what the music had done for a child in Minneapolis, who had needed to know that someone like him could exist in the world and be loved rather than destroyed for existing. The meetings between them have been described by people who were present as something that had the quality of a reunion rather than a first encounter, as though the two men recognized in each other something that had been transmitted long before they shared physical space, and the physical meeting was simply the confirmation of a connection that the music had already established. Little Richard, who had spent decades watching artists he had influenced receive credit and commercial success that sometimes exceeded his own, who had watched his contributions be minimized and his financial rewards be reduced and his place in the historical record be obscured by the industry's preference for simpler narratives. Little Richard received Prince's acknowledgement with something that went beyond simple gratitude. He received it as evidence, as the specific, irreplaceable evidence that what he had done had reached exactly where it needed to reach, that the permission he had given, by being fully himself against every resistance, had traveled across decades and geographies and arrived in the body and the consciousness of a child who had needed it with a desperation that the child himself could not have articulated, but that the music had understood. The relationship between Little Richard and Prince illuminates something about the nature of artistic transmission that is rarely discussed with adequate clarity. We talk about influence as though it is a technical process, as though what passes between artists is primarily technique, style, approach, the observable surface of how someone does what they do. And those things do pass. Prince clearly absorbed elements of Little Richard's performing style, his visual aesthetic, his approach to the relationship between performer and audience. But the deeper transmission was something else. It was the transmission of permission, of the demonstrated proof that a particular kind of existence, flamboyant, gender-bending, spiritually complex, physically total, impossible to contain within conventional categories, was viable, was survivable, could produce not just art but connection, not just expression but community, not just performance but love. Little Richard had survived being Little Richard. He had survived the rejection and the financial exploitation, and the spiritual conflict, and the departures and returns, and the world's sustained confusion about what to do with someone who refused, consistently and at significant personal cost, to be anything less than entirely himself. And in surviving, in continuing to perform and record and insist on his own completeness across decades, he had created the evidence that such survival was possible. Prince needed that evidence. He needed it the way children need proof that the things they fear are survivable, not because someone tells them so, but because someone has done it and is still standing. Little Richard was still standing, still performing, still kicking the piano stool across the stage, still wearing the costumes and the makeup and the pompadour, still being, with undiminished commitment, exactly what he had always been. This was not a small thing. In the cultural moment of Prince's formation, in the America of the 1960s and 1970s, where the lines around acceptable masculinity and acceptable performance and acceptable self-expression were drawn in ways that made a person like Prince genuinely vulnerable. Having the example of someone who had not only survived but prevailed was the specific kind of hope that nothing else could provide. And hope, when it arrives in the form of music made by someone who has lived the proof of it, does something to a person that cannot be undone. It changes what they believe is possible. It changes what they allow themselves to attempt. It changes the size of the life they are willing to try to live. Prince attempted an enormous life. He built one of the most comprehensive and extraordinary bodies of work in the history of popular music, spanning genres, spanning decades, spanning the full range of human emotional experience from the sacred to the profane in ways that consciously echoed and extended what Little Richard had first demonstrated was possible. He controlled his own creative output with a fierceness that came directly from understanding, through Little Richard's example and his own early industry experiences, what happened to artists who did not. He performed with a physical totality and a complete self-investment that was recognizably descended from the same tradition, the tradition of black performance that understood the body as an instrument of truth rather than a vehicle for entertainment. He gave permission in his turn to a generation of artists who needed to see that someone like them could exist and be loved for existing, artists who were different in the specific ways that Prince was different, who were searching for the same evidence that the young Prince had found in Little Richard's records. The chain continued. It always continues. When Little Richard died in May 2020, Prince had already been gone for 4 years, lost in 2016 at 57, too young. The full scope of what he might still have created foreclosed by a death that the world was not prepared for and has not entirely processed. He did not live to publicly mourn the man who had given him permission to be Prince. The tribute that would have meant most, the specific, articulate, publicly witnessed acknowledgement from Prince of what Little Richard had meant, was not made because the man who would have made it was already gone. But the tribute had already been made. It had been made in every performance Prince gave that carried the fire of what he had first encountered in Little Richard's records. It had been made in every interview in which he named the older man and spoke about what the music had done to him. It had been made in the specific choices he made throughout his career. The choices to be visible and theatrical and uncontained and impossible to categorize, that were, in their deepest nature, the fulfillment of a permission that had been granted decades before Prince was born to grant his own. The chain runs from Macon, Georgia to Minneapolis, Minnesota. It runs from a Pentecostal church where a boy first understood what sound could do to a room, to a basement in Minneapolis where another boy taught himself every instrument he could find because the music inside him had nowhere else to go. It runs through New Orleans recording studios and British invasion tours and gospel revivals and rock and roll Hall of Fame inductions and purple stages and the specific, irreplaceable transmission of one performer showing another performer what it looks like when a human being refuses to be anything less than entirely themselves. Little Richard built the permission. Prince received it, transformed it, and built it forward. And somewhere, right now there is a child hearing music made by someone who heard Prince, and feeling in that hearing, The same specific thing that Prince felt when he first heard Little Richard. The knowledge that they are not alone. The knowledge that who they are is not something to be corrected. The knowledge that the thing inside them, the strange, excessive, uncontainable, magnificent thing, is not a defect, it is a gift. And the gift keeps moving, down the chain, through the music, across the decades and the geographies and the categories that the world builds, and artists consistently, gloriously refuse to stay inside. Little Richard refused first, he refused loudest, he refused longest, and in the refusing, he gave everyone who came after him, everyone who needed the evidence that such refusal was survivable, the most important thing one human being can give another. The proof that it is possible to be fully, completely, unapologetically yourself, and to be loved for it. That is what Prince meant, that is what was saved. Not a life in the narrow biographical sense, though perhaps that too in ways that cannot be fully measured. But something larger, the specific possibility of a life lived at full dimension, without apology, without shrinking, without the performance of a smaller self for the comfort of a world that had not yet learned to accommodate the real one. Little Richard made that possible. Prince proved it was still possible a generation later, and the chain, unbroken, continues. The boy from Macon gave the boy from Minneapolis permission to exist, and the boy from Minneapolis gave that permission to the world. That is the story. That is the salvation. That is what the music has always been for.